line of the Commission on rearming Europe, the letter by President Calvino of the European Investment Bank on what the bank is going to do in extending the field of investments in the area of security and defense. And let's not forget the big news from Berlin last night. And tomorrow, so between the news of yesterday and the leaders of the 27 member states of the EU convening tomorrow in Brussels, there is this panel. What a timing, and this panel and the interaction with you, and I hope we will have many questions from the room, on safeguarding global stability and Europe's prosperity and security, I think would deliver a wonderful input for the leaders tomorrow. And I have the feeling myself that with all the proposals that have been put forward yesterday, we are in fact, starting to get the unity of direction we need on the European front. And I very much hope that the possibilities which were presented yesterday, both by the Commission and the European Investment Bank, will indeed lead to a substantial investment in defense. So I'll leave the scene setter at that and give the floor to William, the moderator. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is William Glucroft. I'm a journalist, editor, and moderator based in Brussels. Before that, spent many, many years in Berlin covering German politics, specifically security and defense. So a lot of these issues today are incredibly relevant to me, especially with the news coming out of Berlin in those pre-coalition talks that everyone is watching very closely. As Robert rightly pointed out, there's not much to say. I do think it's important for us to note and keep in mind that the title of this panel is not just about security, but about prosperity. And these two things seem to be increasingly coming into conflict with each other as we are looking at a European level, how to get to those security goals without sacrificing the way of life that security is supposed to be protecting and defending. So these are questions that I hope we will talk about in the panel today, and definitely questions I hope to hear from the audience. We definitely will encourage and find time, make sure we have time at the end for a fair number of questions from you in the audience. With that, I'd like to welcome our really excellent panel. I'm really excited to have the variety of voices that we do. So if I can welcome our panel, in no particular order, Frank Thieser, the Chief Strategy Officer of Quantum Systems, Rosa Balfour, the Director of Carnegie Europe, Stefano Pontecorvo, the Chairman of Leonardo, Andre Denk, the Deputy Chief Executive of the European Defense Agency, and Tarja Jaakkola, the Assistant Secretary General of NATO. So I will move over and we can begin. So I think our first question is going to go all the way to the end here. The furthest person, Andre. I'd love to, I think we should just start off with the big elephant in the room, which is all this news that Robert alluded to, the news that came out of Germany, this 800 billion, which incidentally is also the same top number line that came out of the Draghi report, about 800 billion. The EDA, of course, plays an integral role in this question of collaboration, coordination, getting this money, not just a question of financing, but really to stimulate demand and to reach some of these defense goals. So we'd love, I think, to start with your perspectives on all of that.
Thank you. Robert said it already. This conference is indeed timely. We heard some announcements yesterday, so apparently political leaders mean it seriously. If you want to deter, you need both. You need well-trained, 120% equipped, because you need reserves, modern, well-maintained military forces. This is one side. But then you also need, of course, a defense industry that is able to deliver in quality and quantity, to scale up when it is needed. And it is needed now. So demand and supply side, both, they require money. And that's, I think, what we need to talk about, because I understand we have a lot of financial experts here in the room. So EDA is part of how to organize cooperation. We are an agency that belongs to the 27 member states, to ministries of defense. They pay our budget. We support the 27 member states in the whole cycle of capability development, from research, technology, innovation, capability development projects, even to joint procurement. So just to give you an example, we have 150 concrete projects, politically sometimes not visible, but very concrete on military research, on capability development. We did procurement of artillery ammunition, both for Ukraine and to replenish member state stocks. So a whole bunch of activities, and we are in fact a cooperation platform for the member states. But what is for sure needed is to incentivize a further cooperation, because what we see is there but not sufficient is the amount of cooperation. We need to harmonize requirements of military capabilities. That's what EDA does. We need to aggregate demand. That's where we embarked from and where we are heading to then scale up orders to industry. And I think this is still something that we are lacking. We are working very closely hand in hand with our Commission colleagues from DG Defis for Defense Industry and Space, who have the financial and regulatory administrative power to incentivize a cooperation. And whatever we do is to support EU member states, let's say at least the 23 EU member states that are NATO allies, to fulfill their NATO capability targets, to be able to fulfill their obligations in a collective defense scenario. Bearing in mind that this is, of course, NATO's prerogative, and we can only support member states in achieving this ability.
That's an excellent transition, I think, to Tarja, about that alignment between NATO and the EU, because NATO does take the lead on collective defense, but there's a lot of parallel sort of tracks going on there when it comes to procurement and stimulating demand and seeing how that money gets spent. So, Tarja, maybe you can pick up on those thoughts on where NATO and the EU work together so that it is working together and they're not working at cross purposes, or there's not redundancy, and that it is a more efficient system.
Thank you indeed very much for the very good question. And as Andre also said, congratulations to EIP for selecting such a kind of a topical item for the panel today. EU-NATO cooperation, we have very good staff-level cooperation ongoing in various areas already, so I wouldn't kind of forget that completely. We work on areas like aviation, we work on areas like standardization and different areas. So what we need to actually do now is that we have facing joint challenges, joint security threats, so we need to address them together. We need to work hand in hand, NATO and EU. And in various occasions when I have been speaking about NATO-EU cooperation, I have kind of said that my own approach is that we should look at what are the strengths of NATO and what are the strengths of EU and build our cooperation on those. NATO, like Andre said, we have a NATO defense planning process which sets the capability targets for the NATO nations and then allocates them on a country by country. And that is a very solid process and looking at the threat perception, future threats, and also then setting the targets. And I was very happy to hear Commissioner Kubilius saying during EDA annual conference in January that EU investments actually should be based on the NATO capability targets because the nations have single set of forces. They don't have different capabilities for NATO and for EU. Second area where I think NATO is strong is standardization. So we have what we call technical military standards, and the Secretary General has already shared unclassified NATO standards to EU, so that perhaps EU, in their own initiatives and programs, could take into account these standards and also use their regulatory aspects to further promote the standards. Third area, NATO Supply and Procurement Agency, located here in Luxembourg, very knowledgeable about joint procurement, done tremendous job during the past years. So where then EU is strong? EU has the regulatory power, and EU also has the financial power. And when we combine all these together, I think we can make a good progress in collaboration. So what I would say very much that forget about competition, forget about overlapping, we need to collaborate. And I know that the moderator is looking at the watch that I'm overstepping my time, so I will stop here.
Not at all. It's definitely encouraged to have substantive questions, but I think it's a great way to go to Leonardo, our Leonardo voice, and Stefano. This question of cooperation versus competition, that how to ensure that European companies, especially in the defense sector, are working together, while at the same time, of course, there needs to be healthy competition. This is how the market works, right? So there does seem to be interest on both sides. And you know, we've been talking about this now for 3, 4, 5 years about improving the defense capabilities and also to be giving companies such as yours the predictability and the certainty. Can you tell us a little bit about how has that developed for you right now?
Yeah, thanks, William. Actually, it's not rocket science. I mean, I hear a lot of theory about European, some of it is necessary, some of it is not. We are, Leonardo has announced the biggest joint venture in recent defense industry history with Rheinmetall. There is a procurement necessity by the Italian armed forces. It's a $23 billion program. We looked for the best, 20 billion euros, sorry, it's the same thing more or less now. We looked for the best fit. It was Rheinmetall. We put together what we have and what Rheinmetall has. We have a 50-50 cooperation, and we're doing it. We announced it yesterday. We will be announcing another big, inshallah, cooperation in a few days' time with another big company. But we've been cooperating since 30 years. Eurofighter, NH-90 and ATRs, it's not a military venture. The mail, and so on. Cooperation is there. I mean, companies, when there is to make money and gain market share, companies will jump on it. What the Italian government is doing is I'll talk about my own country, is giving us visibility on long-term projects. Because one of the things, as I say, it's not rocket science, it is an industrial sector like any else, a bit more regulated, which depends more on government spending than others. But still, it works with the dynamics of industries. So you give predictability of what you keep in mind the constraints of the supply chain. In my industry, part of the long lead items, when you get a contract for something particularly complicated, helicopters, which have 3,000 pieces, you have long lead items which suppliers need 18 months to prepare. I'll give you an example. We are one of the biggest, I think the biggest company in the world with helicopters. We make 198 helicopters a year in 8 different models. The less technologically advanced, and I apologize to those who make them, are the wheels. A guy who works for us, in the best hypothesis, makes 98 sets of landing gear. They're not wheels, landing gear. Those are small quantities. So you need to keep in mind that we have a highly specialized supply chain which produces small numbers, which is a problem upon itself. So as I say, it's not rocket science, but you need to keep in mind a number of variables, of which the most important is the foreseeability of your future contracts. The rest in the industry, I mean, I'm not making it simple. The industry will do it.
Well, let's get the other sort of corporate industry perspective here. Maybe you have more to add to that. I think that's an excellent point about highly specialized, which is expensive, but small numbers. We were talking earlier about demand.
Yeah, I mean, I I basically agree to what Stefano said, but I always get the question, I got it here several times, about funding. Is enough funding flowing into those companies and so on? And at the end of the day, that's not the root cause. I mean, we have all the vehicles in place, EIB, for example, also where we're currently negotiating a bigger deal, has everything it needs to have in order to fund companies. But we are, in Europe, not really good in creating demand. I mean, NATO, EDA, for example, from my perspective, and don't be offended, but I think you should really focus 100% on demand. How can we create demand in Europe? I, as a startup, or let's say in a fast-growing company, I mean, we have now 440 people. We grew the last 5 years. We doubled every year. So if you are acting in a functional market, industry will do it, and you get money for that. But you need demand. I mean, we were lucky to a certain extent. Nobody wanted this Ukraine war, but it created significant demand. If you have demand, you can produce highly standardized products. If you produce highly standardized products, and by the way, the military capability of our EU member states, I would say, are all the same if everybody is honest. So if you create highly standardized products, you have very good unit economics and you're international competitive. And this is what we should do. You know, when we start a company, a startup, our mantra is basically focus, focus, focus. Don't do too many things at the same time. And I make now this example, even if I probably don't make friends, I don't need R&D money from EDA. Yeah? I need contracts from governments. The R&D is nice, but I have noticed over the years that there is a business created by some companies around the R&D stuff. The R&D will produce, in best case, a functional prototype or something like that, but we need quantities. My example is always we sell a drone, a small drone for 200K. Let's say that's like a Porsche 911. But we sell now thousands a year. The 911 is, let's say, 10,000 a year, and is basically much more complicated, but it sells at the same price. And it's possible because you have 10,000s and not thousands. I think we can create those demands in Europe. If we put those demands together, we can create significant category leaders in certain countries for specific defense equipment, and then money will flow automatically into those functional markets.
Before we get to Rosa, I do want to get a question, but I do think there's a quick response to that. So while we're on the topic, have a quick reply to that.
Yeah, just to explain you what we are doing, again, the member states are in the driving seat. They decide whether they procure or not. What we offer to member states is one of the EU defense initiatives stemming from 2017. You might remember it, the CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review on Defense, where we visit all member states, by the way, back-to-back with NATO bilaterals that member states have with NATO. And we not only ask them about their plans, to align these plans, but also where do you see collaborative opportunities? Where do you want to cooperate? Berlin, Paris, Rome. What do you want to that we cooperate? So we came up with 18 opportunities, which are agreed by 27 ministers of defense. And out of these 18, 4 letters of intent were signed last year in November by the steering board of EDA in ministers' composition. This is so far only a political declaration. So this is the first step, so to speak, and this has now to translate in concrete projects. And this means to harmonize requirements and aggregate demands towards a joint procurement. And again, you can lead a horse to the water, but you can't make him drink, unfortunately. You need incentives to get them together. And one tool is for sure commission money that could incentivize joint action. And that's where we are now. And this should lead to higher demand, to bigger numbers. At least we strive for it.
Okay. You want to say something?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you. So I couldn't agree more with the comment on contracts and demand, and that is something that our Secretary General also has several times. You need to place contracts, and you need to order. And what we have been doing in NATO is that we have these NATO capability targets, and they are actually the one that show where nations should invest. What we have also done is that we have tried to collect uncontracted requirements from nations last year concerning land battle decisive munitions. Now we are doing the same for air and missile defense. So we get the information for next 10 years, what the nations are planning to procure, and then we are trying to get the nations to do that together, to buy together. And that seems to be the challenge at the moment. Nations still, sorry to say, and also the EU member states, go too much alone. And I'm still shocked, I have to say, that we are talking about incentivizing nations. I worked for EU, for EDA, from 2011 till 2017. Then we were talking about incentivizing nations to work together. Don't we have the incentivization now, because the security situation has changed? We need to work together. We need to face this challenge together. Why do we still need more topics to make us to work together?
That's a great transition question. I think you just asked my next question. Why do we need those incentives, Rosa?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I feel like a little bit the odd person out. I deal with foreign policy and international politics. So let me just take this from a slightly different angle. And admittedly, common security and defense policy was invented in the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. And aspects of this discussion we've been having for the past 33 years, right? And it's about member state cooperation and why they are unable to cooperate. It's about private sector cooperation and why they're not able or willing to cooperate. So I think we really need to ask ourselves the question, is it different this time? And let me just say a few words about why it is different, because actually I think it needs to be reiterated. For people like myself, it's pretty obvious, but as I go out and talk to people working in the international relations community, but also in others, it's not quite so obvious. The first thing I think we need to really, it has to sink in, and that is that what is happening in the United States is very similar to the Bolshevik Revolution, okay? It might be reined in at some point. I don't see the signs of that happening now, but this is what's happening. They're breaking everything they can come across with huge global implications, far greater than those of the Bolshevik Revolution, to be perfectly honest. So this is the context in which we are. In light of the US's decisions, and the latest one about an hour ago was to cut off intelligence to the Ukrainian military, so they will not be able to use their drones to strike their targets against the Russian invasion. So in light of this, we have a major security risk. The first is that if Europeans are not able to step up to support Ukraine, Ukraine will capitulate in a matter of weeks or months. There are different assessments on this. The second is that after Ukraine come other parts of Europe. So there is a huge risk that actually Europe gets torn apart in what appears to be, and we don't really know what's on the mind of Trump in terms of what his worldview of international relations actually is, but what it appears to be a kind of sphere of influence view of international politics. Yesterday he mentioned Greenland again. This is difficult and it's tragic, and there is a risk that this tears Europe apart. So I think the first thing we need to understand is that the urgency around investing on defense is not what we heard a few years ago. It's not what we heard, certainly not what we heard in the 1990s, but it's not the sort of rhetoric about crisis that European leaders have been feeding us since 2008. This is more serious. So that really is my first point. My second point, and I think we need to think about the defense effort as a major economic and societal effort to transform the European economies towards greater defense capabilities, but also fostering innovation, fostering the digital transition, and supporting the climate transition. We need to think about these as a whole and not as separate components of what needs to be done. Why? Because we need European publics to be willing to make those investments, and at the moment there are very different ways in which national governments are proposing to pay for the defense expenditure. There's no common path in that direction. We need to keep the publics engaged and committed. And secondly, because the transformative nature of what is happening coming out of Washington, and if this idea of carving up the world in spheres of influence, well, that means that Europe needs to think about its own sphere of influence. And its success so far has been based on democracy, peace, and prosperity. Those three, words that have characterized European integration so far. So we need to emphasize the value of what Europe can offer for Europeans itself, but also globally. It's a different value proposition to what Russia is suggesting, it's different to what China is suggesting, and it's also different from what the US seems to be suggesting at the moment. Third point is going to be messy. It's going to be, the speed at which things are moving is mind-blowing. Some things might be carried out in the sort of EU treaty format or on the basis of NATO-EU cooperation or according to EDA rules and regulations. Other things might not. And I think we need to be prepared for that. But at some point, we're going to have to make order from the various, rush to increase defense production, joint ventures. Is the European Parliament going to be excluded? Okay, how do we bring the European Parliament back in so that there is democratic accountability for defense spending? How do we make sure that procurement rules are respected? So it's going to be messy because time is of the essence, but at some point we need to pick this piece up. And then finally, if I may, I really think we ought to think about all this in the context of a European Union that is actually seeking to enlarge. Ukraine is a candidate country. This will be a key to Ukraine's success should there be a silver lining to the current situation. But this is also a huge opportunity. It's a huge opportunity for the European Union to expand its market, including its defense market, including its technological know-how. Look at the Ukrainians and their drones. There's huge know-how, there are huge opportunities there. So we need to think about this in a wider scale. And, in addition to that, we have a whole set of countries that want to join the European Union. We're now collaborating with the United Kingdom, which has left the European Union. We're collaborating with NATO, which is also a member of, with Norway, which is also a member of NATO. There'll be greater opportunities to work with other countries on a pan-European scale.
Well, if there's a line to take away today, I think it's the United States looking like the Bolshevik Revolution might be one of them. Thank you very much for giving us that broader view. I think it's really important to always be keeping that in mind as we get into the nitty-gritty of how exactly do you do these business deals and collaboration versus competition. And also for pointing out just how fast-moving this is. When we were preparing this conversation a few weeks ago, we were talking about the Munich Security Conference. And I think I even said in our call, I said, who knows what the world's going to look like in 2 weeks? And we're seeing the effects of that. So given that everything Rosa has said, I just want to kind of open up if there's any response to that, because I think Rosa touched on a lot of important points there. If there's anything in particular. I'm seeing blank stares. No, I'm seeing a hand. Excellent. Thank you, Andre.
Yeah, perhaps not a reaction to you, but rather a clarification, perhaps. I don't want to be understood in a too negative way. Looking at the possibilities and the current state of play at the European Union, I'm rather positive. I think the urgency is well understood. We read it in the letter from President von der Leyen again yesterday. We heard it from Berlin yesterday evening. So there's really a will to step up. This is the first point. At EDA, I mentioned the letters of intent, the political will to cooperate in very concrete terms. So they signed, the ministers, those who pay for the equipment. They signed letters of intent for integrated air missile defense, for loitering ammunitions. And this takes off now. So we are discussing now, okay, whenever we talk about loitering ammunitions, what is it? What are we talking about? Which requirements do you have? And now let's harmonize these requirements, that everybody agrees that's exactly what we need in this capability field. And then let's ask, okay, who needs how many? In order to then together procure. And I can tell you 1.5 years ago, the European Defence Agency, not a procurement agency per se, We are rather in capability development, rather a little bit long-term perspective, but we were called to procure artillery ammunition for howitzers, EU-made howitzers that were delivered to Ukraine. 5 months from the first question from Mr. Borrell to me, can you do this, to the first framework contract that we signed with European industry. By the way, only European industry, because this is to our rules, and I'm convinced that we need to step up the European defense industry if we as Europeans want to be capable to deter. Now, 5 months for the first framework contract for an agency that usually does not this, and then currently we are at 60 framework contracts to really have every company in Europe under contract that is able to deliver projectiles, fuses, all-up rounds, and so on and so forth. So I'm rather positive, but again, it now has to be organized, unfortunately still incentivized, and then we need the money to procure.
And speaking of that money, turning back to Tarja for a moment, given everything we're hearing, to what extent do you feel that this intense focus on the percent of GDP, whether it's 2 or 3 or 5 or whatever it's going to be, is more of a distraction? Because whether a country is spending 2% or 5% on its defense, if there isn't these incentives, if there isn't this efficiency, if there's still not the demand as we've heard, is it more of a question of how money is getting spent than how much?
I guess that was for me.
It is, given the NATO spending targets,
yes,
I do think,
of course.
unfortunately to you.
Yes, there has been quite a lot of discussion about the percentage. So my understanding is that there is a common understanding now that the 2% as a floor is not enough. Our Secretary General has mentioned that we need to go beyond 3. And that, of course, is a discussion that will need to be taken at the political level. But it needs to be put in the context as well. So I'm still getting back to the NATO capability targets that are being developed and discussed with the nations at the moment. And to be able to implement those targets, nations need to increase their defense spending. That's the fact. And what is then the percentage that we are talking about? That's completely another question, or not a completely another question, but that needs to be taken into this context. To be able to underspend let's say, the extra funds that we have efficiently. And there are, of course, various topics that we need to take into account. We are very much promoting multinational collaboration. It brings together, let's say, the demand signal from different nations, creates economies of scale, larger contracts to the industry, who is then able to invest in additional production capacity, but it also increases the interoperability. And that is actually the key that is here, that the nations, if needed, are able to operate together. We have seen in Ukraine what it means if the equipment that they have are not interoperable. If they cannot use 155mm ammunition in a weapon system that has been donated by another nation. And that is the key also when we talk about the multinational collaboration, that if needed, we are able to operate together, we are able to fight together. But then it's also about the efficiencies and also about kind of using the funds in a kind of efficient and cost-effective manner. You mentioned earlier prosperity versus kind of a defense. I perhaps would turn that around and said, can we have prosperity if we don't have peace and stability, and if we are not able to maintain our democratic Western values? And from that perspective, I don't see these as a kind of a contradictory or against each other. I see defense actually building a society where we can strive and be also prosperous.
Stefano, I had to skip over you in a moment if you'd like to add something.
Can I add on to that? Because you're correct that the financing bit has taken over the whole debate. I remind myself first and everybody else that in 1989, and I was a young second secretary in the Italian delegation in NATO, the wall falls. But in 1989, the average defense spending of the EU members in NATO was 4%. Then the wall fell. NATO reinvented itself thanks to a great idea by, well, the first one who launched the idea was the British Perm Rep, and we invented NATO as a peacekeeping machine, so to speak. What was at the time out of area. You couldn't speak about out of area because it was out of area. So you become a peacekeeping machine. So the NATO capability targets move the enemy was no more there. NATO, the Gorbachev was in power, and we were having a love affair with the Russians, which unfortunately was interrupted. And we turned the NATO capability targets, turned our military instruments to where they should have been, which is peacekeeping. So all heavy armor was no longer needed. You needed strategic airlift, intelligence, medevac, and all this stuff. Lighter soldiers and so on. We did have a peace dividend. We had a hell of a peace dividend because the 4% went down to an average of 1.4%. Just go and look at the figures. Don't believe my word for it. Went down to 1.4%. With a different set of less soldiers and different set of military equipment. Now we've got to reverse that. That's why I say it's not rocket science. We know what we need. We have, NATO tells us. I also believe that there is no competition between NATO and the EU, none whatsoever. The EU takes on a crisis management role when and if we will be able to do that. NATO keeps the defense. In the meantime, the EU goes for what they're doing now, the big multinational projects. But that's also pretty easy. The financing is not really important. You are perfectly right. 1 billion. Now, the EIB has announced 1 billion. That's a very nice step, a huge step, knowing well the EIB. But $1 billion euros is less than half of the research budget of Leonardo in 2024, which was 2.2. Then you see how you calculate it. We don't need the 1 billion. Maybe small and medium companies do. So what are you going to do with this 1 billion? I mean, there are a lot of people smarter than me thinking about what you can do. The supply chain, it's huge. We are all assemblers. On a helicopter, you put 3,000 pieces. We don't make them all at home. So you need to secure the supply chain. Look at what the Chinese have their hands on everything we need, from 50 to 90% of lithium to anything you can mention, is in the Chinese hands. That is what you need to look at if you want to make a strong European. Don't look at the big companies. Big companies need the contracts. And then we'll work. Help us to reinvigorate a supply chain which is lagging, which is flagging.
Frank, maybe you want to pick up on that as a smaller company in this space.
I do agree. I mean, the supply chain is probably not such a big deal for the smaller companies compared to the big ones, but we need to look at sovereignty in general. And if we don't get it here, we have a big problem. I mean, we have now had so many wake-up calls, and I still think we are not fundamentally changing something. Again, I look at NATO, at EDA, at all these institutions. They are harmonizing, and they're doing an incredibly good job, and all the people are totally motivated. So I think it has to be higher level decision actually to harmonize things, or just to make a decision. My topic is again quantity. I'm always coming back to this quantity because that's the root cause of everything. And I'm just wondering if it's not possible. I mean, look at Ukraine. There was the demand, and all these companies here, I think Stefano had the same experience. You can take Rheinmetall, Airbus, whatever, and us. We were able to deliver. We scaled up because the contracts were there. We delivered much, much faster compared to a traditional procurement program, which would have been set up by a certain government. And you see that it works. So I personally think if organizations take NSPA, for example, as a procurement organization, NATO in general, EDA, if they would focus 100% on creating those demands and maybe not spending too much on harmonizing, because in reality, all these big programs like Eurofighter, NH-90 helicopter, everybody tried to harmonize requirements, but at the end of the day, we have created 28 variants, I think, in NH-90, and we have produced 500.
Yeah, but don't call me in because I don't want to alienate my customers. So
and we have produced, and imagine we have produced 500.
Excuse me, you're perfectly right, because Eurofighter is 4 different Eurofighters. You're perfectly right.
Take Eurofighter, 200 Eurofighters plus or minus, compared to, I think it's 5,000 F-16 and 2,000 F-18, for example. In the transport helicopter, we have built 500 NH-90 versus 6,000 Black Hawks. How can we produce competitively for a good pricing point equipment which can be provided on more or less off the shelf on short notice and to scale up demand if you not manage to handle those demand questions? This is the ultimate question of everything. And the second point, of course, which plays into demand, is not just European demand, it's the whole NATO demand. Basically, we are all selling to NATO countries primarily. So if our governments are not able, I think some are much better, some are worse, to help us to export significantly in countries which should receive our equipment. Not all of them should receive probably our equipment around the world, but primarily NATO countries. Then we have, from my perspective, solved the root cause. And then all the different programs in place to provide debt funding or equity funding, they work automatically because we have functional markets.
Rosa, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think a couple of sort of more political points, less technical points. I think the first thing, on defense, there are 2 things. The first is, what does Ukraine need? And so far, Zelensky has gone to, well, he used to go to Biden, and go to saying, I need this, that, with a shopping list, right? And then, you know, the sector, NATO, EU, NATO members, and etc., would, you know, do what they could or wanted to support Ukraine. The second bit is that Europeans need to think about their territorial defense, possibly without the United States support. Okay, so the first is immediate, the second is a longer-term plan. It's not going to happen overnight. And that's where a lot of the spending discussions come in. Second point on spending, again, the politics of it. 2%, Poland is spending 5%, Estonia is also spending very high percentage of its GDP, and then we still have countries that are spending well below the 2%, despite the commitment made over 10 years ago. I think one key point to make is that even for those countries that are spending 1.5%, if that expenditure is not put to efficient use, it's a waste of money, right? And I think that is a political argument that needs to be made. So it's not about, you know, it's not, okay, I mean, obviously, if you look at the, you know, whole of a nation's budget, there will be items that might get cut, further cuts. But I think the key point to make is that we need efficiency. If certain countries are spending 1.5%, but then are not of their GDP on defense, but then they are actually not able to protect themselves from, you know, pretty basic Russian hacks, for instance, or, you know, cyber attacks or undersea cable attacks, then maybe that amount is not put well, you know, is not being spent well. Final point, and if I may, you know, just reiterating why this is so serious. Why do I reiterate it? Because the politics is not necessarily there. We've seen an incredible change taking place in Berlin over the past couple of days. Until yesterday, it wasn't at all certain that it would play out this way, but, you know, Friedrich Merz has been, he really performed a U-turn overnight when he was elected. We've seen France and we've seen Britain step up. But I think other countries are still wondering and still, you know, wondering what their priority is. For instance, Poland so far has been saying we need to focus on Poland's defense and not necessarily on Ukraine's defense. So has been hasn't been making the commitments that the French and the British have been making about supporting Ukraine with boots on the ground and planes in the air if need be. We also have to remember that there are some Trump supporters in Europe. And so they might feel that actually the allure of Trump's ideology, policy, etc., is stronger than the benefit of being part of the European Union. And, so they might feel, given that the US is a NATO member, that, their interests lie in supporting the alliance with the US rather than doubling down on strengthening Europe. So it's not to be taken for granted that we have that type of political support to move forward on the various plans that have been announced and on the decisions that will probably be made tomorrow, etc., etc. So while I think the train is moving in the right direction from my personal perspective, there are political issues that need to be looked at and addressed because, it's going to be very complicated bargaining. There are going to be trade-offs. There's going to be dissent. So the political picture is going to look complex.
And not only Trump-friendly views in the EU, but also views that align more with Russia and increasing far-right. To Tarja's point earlier about protecting democracy, but our democracies are facing internal threats that then 5% of defense spending will not get to. I want to see, I can't really see with these lights, but I want to see if there are going to be questions. We would love to have questions from the audience. I do see, wonderful. Let's already start some questions. I saw a hand there. If there are microphones to go around on the end, in the middle, kind of put your hands up. And thank you for turning those lights down so I can see a little bit. Yeah, thank you very much.
Sorry to ask a question again. My name is Ciprian Stănescu. I come from Romania, so I have an understanding of what's going on across the border. A question, great panelists, but I have a question specifically for Rosa, but also if others want to jump in. What's the worst case realistic scenario for countries in Eastern Europe? NATO or non-NATO members like Moldova, but also Romania and the Baltics in the next year or so. Because you said that if Ukraine fails or falls, other countries might come up next. Thank you.
Should I go for that?
Let's go for it. Yeah.
The assessments that I'm reading, and I have Carnegie Endowment is a global think tank. I have colleagues who analyze Russia very carefully. The assessments that I'm reading is that the Russian war effort is also, life is going ahead as normal in Moscow. In fact, it's quite lively, apparently. But nonetheless, the war effort does have a heavy toll. And so one of the reasons for which all these talks about a ceasefire is not just because Donald Trump has mentioned it, because that's his agenda. It's also because both sides need a break. But it's also general assessment, in war. But it's also a general assessment that Russia will use the pause to regroup. So I think if Ukraine were to capitulate, or if a ceasefire deal were to take place without Ukraine's interests, first and foremost, the risk is, I would say, for those countries in Eastern Europe that have Russian minorities, I'm afraid, because that is the sort of type of excuse that Russia has privileged. We've got elections, as you know, in Moldova coming up. We know how much Russia has invested in electoral processes in Romania, actually, by the way, in Georgia and in Moldova at the moment. So I think a lot of the non-military offensive that Russia is carrying out is very much targeting Russian speakers and proxies in these countries that can cause unrest. So I would say those are the areas that are most under threat. It might not happen in the next 12 months, but I would definitely consider those areas, as sort of red alarm areas moving forward.
I don't know if, would anyone else want to take that, or should we turn back to some more questions? Stefano?
Can I give just a, just a thought? And I'm sure I'm going to regret this. Everything stands. We need to be careful. I lived 10 years in Russia, Moscow, Soviet Union, and then Russia. We're talking about 140 million people with a GDP 2/3 of Italy. Bogged down in Ukraine since 3 years. Are we sure we need to be terrified? That's a question that I regret having put. That's it.
Nonetheless, a question I welcome. Thank you for putting that out there. So given a question for a question, are there others?
Well, actually, can I answer that?
Yeah, of course, please.
Because
we'll get to your question in just a second.
Okay,
yeah.
we need to take it seriously. But you're right that we have overestimated the strength of Russia. But because of that, we haven't been responding appropriately. I mean, I think...
But, you look at the newspapers. The Russians have taken, maybe I know Russian, I speak Russian, I was a Russian interpreter, I read the Russian telegram. The Russians have taken this village. Oh, and where did they go for? 7 miles. Then the Ukrainians have taken other 7 miles. Now, it's a tragedy, there's no doubt. I'm not belittling anything. We need to be ready. Talking about the figures. The Americans, the comparison and why we do to the question you asked. The Americans, 2023, bought 250 billion, more or less, of major platforms. The EU, all of us, 110. The Americans, this 250 billion is on 12 major platforms, the EU on 30 major platforms. The end result of this reasoning is that the Americans have R&D for 20 billion on each platform, we 4 billion. Of course they will have the better, exactly what you were saying, they will have the better R&D, the better technology and so on. There's a lot of room for improvement, which is what, these are all figures which is what the EU and NATO are trying to do. Still, let's keep things in context.
I think Russia, despite having a shrinking economy and a basically bankrupt economic model whereby it needs to go to war, has managed to achieve global influence which far exceeds its real influence. And that's, and now with the normalization of relations with the United States, it is achieving one of its major goals. The next goal is reducing Ukraine to a puppet state and getting rid of Zelensky. And he's getting the US support for that. So the question is, what do the Europeans want? I do agree very much that the narrative in Europe could be flipped. This can be done. And this is not what has been said. Yeah.
Things are getting spicy. There's 10 minutes left, unfortunately. We can go on for much longer, but let's take another question. I think the second row here? Yeah. Right there to the, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Peter de Gooijen. I'm with the Brunswick Group, and I used to be, formerly I was a Netherlands representative to the EU. I would pick up a point that Ms. Balfour made, and that is there is the immediate need and there is the intermediate need. Now, the immediate need has to be addressed, I would imagine, by the European Council tomorrow. I just suspect that quite a few of you must have seen copies of what is circulating as probably the outcome of the European Council. Are you happy with that? Does that answer what is needed now to be decided in view of what has happened over the last couple of weeks? And can I add to this, because there will be some opposition to elements of these draft conclusions, and yet we're in a hurry to address that immediate need. Is it absolutely necessary that we stick to the 27 formats plus willing cooperative partners like the UK or Norway? Or would you see that we should perhaps move outside the institutional framework and set up an ad hoc thing to run this?
So thoughts on the conclusions that we might already have from the summit meeting tomorrow, and I guess a so-called coalition of the willing.
I wouldn't like to speculate about the outcome of tomorrow's meeting. There are, of course, drafts circulating. We have seen them, perhaps not all, but some of us. But this is not finalized. So I would rather suggest let's wait and see what comes out of the political discussion tomorrow. However, I think we all agree that something has to happen now. We have to be bold, and we all, the European Union now has to step forward. Whether this will be a successful political move tomorrow, we'll see. We'll see whether President von der Leyen's letter will be appreciated, will be adopted, or whatsoever, and the plan will move into this direction. I can only say I hope so, because this is the prerequisite for more. Berlin is not sufficient. The whole EU has to step up and put money on the demand side to procure those things that are now needed. And we all know what is needed. We can derive it in an academic way. We can look into our inventories. It's very clear. The President's letter from yesterday clearly indicates the path. So we are talking about air missile defense, drones, counter-drones, electronic warfare, military mobility, and so on and so forth. So this is very clear. There's no need to ask ourselves what we need now. The question is, how do we organize ourselves, and how do we make it happen? And I think it's now important that everybody takes his job. The organizations, EU, NATO likewise, in close cooperation, hand in hand, and EU institutions, that's the intergovernmental part, like EDA, the Commission, the European External Action Service, and so on and so forth. Quite fragmented, I have to admit. However, we are working closely together to organize this joint cooperation towards hopefully high demand, that results then in a procurement which is then conducted by whomever. But we know what we need. It has to happen now. It requires money from the member states. And even, this is perhaps one point I wanted to add and ask perhaps back to the audience, we hear from defense industry, not the primes, not Leonardo, but others, that access to finance is still a huge issue. And I want to ask you here in the audience, who are coming from private banks, from governmental banks, why do you not finance weapons and ammunitions? Because we need weapons and ammunitions. I'm not naive, I'm not blind. Banks have to survive on the financial market. We have ESG criteria, and so on and so forth. I have a military background, but I still struggle to understand the banks that they are still resisting. Thank you. Over to you.
From Q&A to A and Q, I think, for directing questions back to the audience. Richard, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think I'd like to answer, will I be satisfied? I mean, it depends on your parameters. By comparison to the usual speed, then it's pretty impressive. By comparison to what is needed, perhaps a little slow. But I do think it's partly to do with the negotiations at 27, and there are obstacles there. And precisely because of the obstacles that we know quite well, and again, because of the fact that, you know, a lot of the change and a lot of the impetus actually came from the Franco-German understanding on what needed to be done on defense, which, you know, is actually a couple of decades old, if not longer, very historically rooted, which actually makes me think that at this point in history, we need to be perhaps less focused on the institutions and the roles of them, but actually really be focused on what keeps things moving. I think it's critical for the Commission, especially on defense, which has always been very much a national prerogative. I think it's essential that the Commission and the EU institutions really put themselves to the service of a greater goal rather than think about what is at stake in terms of interinstitutional balance. I really think that's important. But, you know, this is, you know, an exceptional historical moment. We will need to think about the institutional balance, accountability, et cetera, at some point. So it's not something that can be put aside. And I mentioned the role of the European Parliament, for instance, in accountability. We ought to have that for national parliaments as well. This is, you know, something that is involving all our societies. But I think in the immediate, I would favor a coalition of the willing framework, also to open up to non-EU partners who are willing to step up.
I think it is a good question, Andre. I'm happy that you asked this. Although I said before, financing is not an issue if you have demand, I still would say that's the case. But when we negotiated with EIB some years ago, first venture debt, it was so difficult because ESG was borderline when it comes to dual-use technology. I'm not talking about weapons now. Today, dual use is not an issue anymore, but weapons is maybe something in the gray zone everybody will think about. Also investment funds, if they are backed by the IF or by other institutional investors, it's probably a problem. What I'm saying is that the trend is okay, it's positive, but we are still not there. And I think we should even, and everybody who is an investor, or even the EIB, should even think one step further. I remember well a discussion in Germany in the government in the last coalition before the last government about weaponized drones. Germany was not able to purchase weaponized drones for many, many years. Nobody understood, and it has changed now, but I think we have even reached, we should look ahead the next 10 years, and I'm pretty sure we will be faced with technology which is ethically at least debatable, beyond weaponized drones, very bad things our adversaries will develop. They will do it in any case, and if you're not doing it, and if you're not able to fund this kind of businesses, we have still to regulate it. We can handle it with our democracies, I think, in a good way, but if you're not investing in such technology, somebody else will do it, and we will not win whatever could possibly happen. That's a really, really concerning problem for me, and I think we have to spend time on this and look ahead what crazy technology is coming up.
I think we have time for one more question, and I have a hand right here. Oh, no, sorry, I apologize. I have a question. Well, the answer we can take in the coffee break.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Rieber. I work for the EIB. Given that my military knowledge is nil, actually limited to a mandatory military service at the age of 18, I would have one question to the industry, actually. And what really struck me, in particular, by the intervention of Stefano, if I understood correctly, you were mentioning that your company is producing 200 helicopters each year.
198.
198, less than 200. Now, this really struck me because, I mean, the US Army has more than 4,000 helicopters. So we're speaking a lot about finance, etc. So how will we really scale up on the capacity side? You're representing a firm with more than 50,000 employees, leading firm in aerospace, defense, security. There are not so many firms like you around, right?
No, there aren't. Thank you for that.
So this is really a question out of curiosity. I mean, will it take us 10, 20 years to be, because we should be there where the States are, not where Russia is.
Absolutely. No, we produce, I'll tell you more. We're 60,000, first of all, 32,000 in Italy and 30,000 elsewhere, about 12,000 suppliers around the world. And we produce actually helicopters in the US, UK, Poland, and Italy, and now Switzerland also. We've acquired a small but great company which makes monomotors. That comes back to, that fits in perfectly well with, and by the way, the Americans buy our helicopters too. We make them in Philadelphia. The 139 is the best-selling helicopter in the world. And part of our helicopters, I mean, 60% of our helicopters are actually civilian. So we do for oil and gas and for search and rescue and so on, transportation. Tomorrow's, well, what will come out of tomorrow's European Council is going to be relevant because already as it is, we are buying, the Europeans are buying 50% more or less of defense budget allocations are for systems made in the US. We are more or less at full capacity, more or less. In fact, with Rheinmetall and with other joint ventures we're doing, we're putting together what we already have. We're not investing. We will be investing on upgrades and so on because tanks are not what they used to be. Nothing is what they used to be. What is going to be important if you want to reinforce, and it comes back to the question, what is needed now and what's needed in the medium term? If you get a boatload of money, as we say in Italian, and governments run to spend it, that will go a lot out of Europe. Koreans, for example, US, naturally. I still can't consider the UK out of Europe, but for all defense purposes, it is not out of Europe. Hopefully it never will be. So if you really want to, with that money, start to construct, but policymakers know this better than I do, you want to construct a European defense industry, an integrated European defense industry. You get together, there is no reason for which an Italian, a Spanish, and here I am alienating my customers, there's no reason for which an Italian, French, German, and Spanish tanks need to be different. There's no reason. So you start, there are different variants, but the basis can be the same. Airplanes, helicopters, and so on. So you find a way, again, it's not rocket science, to start building up the capacity you're going to need, going back to the 4% that was in 1989, and transforming, doing the reverse path from territorial defense to peacekeeping, and then from peacekeeping to territorial defense. It all has a logic. Nothing was done harebrained. The military know what they're doing. They respond to the necessities. They're not people who wake up in the morning and say, I'll do this now. There's a reason. The way the money which becomes available or the financing possibilities which come available, for example, by allentare, how do you say, by weakening a bit the stability, thank you, the Stability Pact, and not considering the defense in the 3% of the Stability Pact. There are a number of creative ways of doing it. Then the governments need to really take a hard look at how to incentivize a common European defense industry platform and integration through the money which is being made available. I say we, but BA Systems, Rheinmetall, KNDS, Nexter, Safran, everybody cooperates already. With some countries, it is easier to cooperate than with others. With some countries, it's a lot more difficult to cooperate. But I think the time has come. There is, a new understanding that national sovereignty is fine, that there is also the economic aspect. I know I'm going above my allotted time, but our new attack helicopter, it was $800 million, 800 million euros of government money for the new technologies. Does the Italian government want to share what they have financed? They do. Do others? Let's see.
I think we're going to let Stefano have that final word there, given that we are over time. For me, these main takeaways, and there's so much more to talk about, demand versus finance, efficiency in defense spending versus amount of defense spending, and the regrettable question from Stefano, the calibration of the threat. For me, these are the three interesting things I'm going to be taking away from today and going into our coffee break. So let's take all of these questions into an informal conversation. Thank you very much for our panelists, and have a good rest of your day.
And I'm just going to add that we will be back here and we will start again at 4:30. So it's a condensed coffee break, but we will start on time at 4:30.